Real North American history is currently being destroyed by the various power structures that currently control many aspects of our society. Now, I don't say this from some kind of a crazy, conspiracy theory, weird schizo point of view. I say this because this is a problem that I have legitimately run into over the past few decades of studying history. The craziest part about this whole thing is that when you start to learn anything about real American history, you immediately run into barriers. And then if you follow up and try to find out why there are barriers to you learning something about a history, you inevitably always end up hitting some kind of a wall that involves some messed up power structure. Right? It doesn't matter if it's a corporate structure, an academic structure, a government structure, it doesn't matter. All of these entities are all guilty of getting in the way of people learning the truth about what happened in North America. And it's so weird because you would think, why? Like, who cares? Who cares what happened a couple of thousand years ago? We should be able to learn what happened a couple of thousand years ago and put that in our histories, right? No matter what it is. That is how you are supposed to approach this scientifically. It doesn't matter what the truth is the truth, and you build upon the truth, no matter what. Now, of course, we don't live in that world. We absolutely do not live in a world where truth prevails, obviously, because if we did, then basically every single politician and the vast majority of academia and all of corporate people, they'd all be hanging from a roof right now and being executed for crimes against humanity, because that's what should be. Now, North American history, generally speaking, it's not really that interesting if you take a mainstream approach. Mainstream academia will essentially have you believe that really not all that much has happened in North America over the past, thousands or tens of thousands of years. The way that it's taught nowadays is that we have an Indian population that has existed on the continent for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, or, whatever they currently say. And those people did absolutely nothing except wander around and hunt buffalo and just live off the land for tens of thousands of years. So, when you hear that kind of a history, and you kind of, it's not that interesting. For most people, that kind of a history is very bland. And in the modern age, the reality is, regardless of all of the woke political garbage going on, most people are not interested in North American Indian history. I mean, that's just the reality. And the reason is, there's two main reasons. Well, the first reason is that entire history is taught in the most bland way possible with respect to how Westerners look at it. Or, more to the point, how the Western systems teach it, how the Western systems convey this kind of a history. Now, I'm using the North American Indians as an example, but this is going to carry on to all aspects of North American history. I'm just using them as an example simply because it's probably the most well-known example I can think of. All right? So when you look at North American Indian history, and if you want to use them as an information source for the North American continent, you run into not only the bland problem, and by the way, I'm not trying to say that kind of lifestyle is like bad or something like that. What I'm saying is that because that lifestyle is not full of just tons of crazy adventure, right? Most people will ignore it. The living off of the land, simply moving from spot to spot, and nothing really happening, that is not a captivative story for most audiences. I mean, that's just a psychological reality. So a lot of Westerners, especially historians, will tune out this aspect of history. Right? They think they generally get it. Yes, we understand these people were very simple and they just moved around and they just lived off the land and that's it. Nothing really happened. And so nobody really pays attention to it. Like, it doesn't grab anybody's attention, and because it doesn't do that, a lot of researchers just don't care. And since there is nothing enticing, no real research is ever really done in this area that matters. Now, of course, if you want to try to get into, say, North American Indian history, you can go to the source, which is what you should do, right? You should go and ask the tribes that still carry on some of these histories. Like, just go ask them, okay, what happened? Can you please tell me your history? When you do that, the researcher is going to be confronted with some fairly crazy stories. At least crazy relative to a Western mindset. You're going to be confronted with all kinds of things like, animals, animal spirits, catastrophes, thunderbirds. You're going to be confronted with all of this mystical sounding, metaphysical god stuff going on with nature. And of course, for your average Western researcher, that's no good. You can't have that. You can't take any of that seriously. So this is why the North American Indian histories are conveyed, or not conveyed, they are relegated to essentially the basement of just places that people don't care about. Right? Because, your average researcher cannot use these stories, which sound crazy, as real historical data. Because, of course, gods are not real, thunderbirds are not real, Raven was not in the sky, the mountains were not built overnight, blah, blah, all of that stuff. It's all way too crazy for your average Western trained researcher, so they have to throw it to the side. And they do, they get rid of it, they don't care. So what happens is that entire people's history is ignored, or at the very least, it's funny, academic researchers this is what they actually think, right? They don't say this part out loud, but they believe themselves to be above, the savages of the American Indians. They don't say this, but, they think they have it all understood because, they're just so much smarter, right? They have science and all of that stuff. And then, the reality is all those tribes recording all of those histories are crazy. And the academics, they truly know what's going on, but they take pity on the tribes and they just say, oh, yeah, you're fine, good, yes, we respect your tradition. All the while the academic is laughing behind their back because they don't respect their tradition. They don't care. They don't care about any of that. Obviously, they don't care. It's funny. For example, if you go and you go see some of these academic researchers who are in a standard university or whatever, and they go and look at the pictographs that are all over, well, they're all over the world, but if you go and look at the way they approach the ones in North America, for example, they treat the people who drew these pictographs into rock, or I should say petroglyphs, they treat the artists of these petroglyphs essentially like children. That's the way they treat them. They treat them like they are just, low IQ genetic trash who the best they could do is just carve some weird stick figures into the side of a rock. Right? And the Western academic literally believes these people to have a low mentality because that is all they were really doing. So Western academia just doesn't care. Right? The analysis that they will give you for all of this stuff is hilarious, and it's completely insulting. I mean, it's hilariously insulting. To make matters worse, of course, even the descendants of North American Indian tribes now, even they don't know their histories anymore. Right? You can go and listen to and read books from old school shamans. A lot of them are gone now, so you have to go find the books in like the 60s, maybe the 80s. And if you can find some interviews with some of these guys, those exist as well. One of the number one complaints from these shamans is they say that the new kids do not care about the recorded history. Right? They don't care about any of it. They don't care about the spirits. They don't care about the animals. They don't care about any of that anymore. And the reason why is simple. They have been westernized as well. Right? Nobody's immune from this stuff. It's funny, a lot of Western people believe that like all these Native American Indian traditions are just being carried on perfectly, and that is not the truth at all. We are losing all of that history. And this is unfortunately being done on purpose. This is not just an effect of technological advancement and supposed social advancement, although, it is to one degree or another, or I should say advancement of science. But there is also a concerted effort being made by certain power structures to try and erase the stories of the North American Indians. Not only are they trying to erase their history, they are erasing any scrap of history with any respect to any culture everywhere at all that had anything to do with North America beyond, say, a few hundred years ago. All history regarding North America is being erased. It is being destroyed right in front of us, and it is being done by people on purpose. This is not an accident. So, this begs the question, why? Why is North American history being erased? Why is it being dumbed down? Why is it being changed right before our eyes? Why is this happening? In a just society, in an honest society, in a truly scientific society, this should be impossible. But it's happening right in front of us, and all of us are falling victim to it. This is the problem that I am running into when I'm doing my research nowadays. The interesting thing about North America is that I didn't really focus on North America up until about maybe 10 years ago. For me, North American history is a relatively new thing, and by history I mean ancient history. Because I had fallen for all of the tricks just like everybody else. Right? I believed that, yeah, okay, fine, the North American Indians, they were here. They ran around for thousands of years just, being hippies all day, and okay, fine, whatever. That's what they were. Whatever. Okay, great. I'm going to go study Egypt now, where things were happening in Egypt, right? Like I said, the way the North American Indian histories are presented is they are presented boring. There's nothing to them. Egypt, for example, is much more interesting on the surface, right? So that's why everybody goes and studies Egypt over North American Indian history. It's literally that simple, and the psychology there is being exploited. I cannot stress that enough. That is absolutely being exploited. There are, unfortunately, people in high places of power who are well aware of how to sway social opinion on matters. And if you can control social opinion, if you can control the history, you control the past. If you control the past, you essentially control the present and the future. It's the whole Orwell thing, right? That is what is going on. So, North America actually has an insane history. The more I'm learning about the true history of the continent of North America, and by extension South America as well, they're both kind of in the same boat, but I'm just going to focus on North America, the crazier history is getting. Now, the first thing we have to do if we're going to ever understand North American history, ancient history that is. I'm not talking about history from like 200 or 300 years ago. I don't mean like the Civil War or the Revolutionary War or the Spanish Banana War or whatever, random war was fought, whatever, the War of 18 bajillion. No, I mean like what happened in North America like 2,000 years ago. This is the kind of stuff that is weirdly being blocked, being destroyed, being obfuscated, right? Or being changed. This is the crazy stuff. North America is generally not really factored in to any of the ancient history with respect to how humans developed. And I already kind of covered the reasons why, right? They've made it boring. They've made it seem like nothing was going on. They've made it seem plain. But oddly enough, North America may actually be the key to understanding a lot of what has happened to planet Earth within the last few thousand years. And the reason why I say that is because North America has this weird uniqueness to it in the sense that when the Europeans show up, one of the amazing things that they note is how fresh the continent is. Now, yes, there were people living on the continent, but those people were scattered all over hell and back. There was not, hundreds of millions of them conglomerating into these huge cities, right? Nobody was progressing. For whatever reason, North America is very much a fresh landmass, and it is sparsely populated by people. Now, this might not sound weird at first. This might sound like, yeah, who cares, whatever. People were still evolving or whatever, if you take the uniformitarianism garbage. But none of this makes sense if you apply basic science and history. If you look all over the world, we find humans in fairly decent numbers, moving and shaking and doing things. We find, remnants of huge civilizations all over the place. Right, over in Asia, Europe, Africa, in South America as well. We find all kinds of ancient structures, right? We have temples, megaliths, you name it. There are some insane things that have been discovered, and they're out there. You can go visit them. But when North America enters the picture into history, there's nothing here. There's no huge temples. There's no megaliths. Right? There's no huge pyramids that we're digging up from underneath the ground or something. There's just nothing. When the Europeans arrive, they find a fresh continent. This freshness is taken for granted. In the modern times, nobody blinks an eye at this weirdness. And it is weird. Make no mistake, it is extremely weird that North America is essentially untouched. The North American Indians, yes, they are there, but they are only lightly exploiting the resources. Now, mainstream will have you believe that these people were just, dumb savages, and they were just, doing what they could with their low technology, and they just weren't smart enough to build themselves up, and blah, 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 blah. And people believe that. That's what people believe. But what if there's a different reason why the North American Indians were in the state that they are in when the Europeans show up? Right? North American Indians aren't stupid. They are not, they are displayed as savages, even though, modern academics won't say it, but that's what they're thinking, by the way. A modern academic does not give any intellectual credit to anybody in the past, 1,000 years or so that lived in North America. Right? Don't think for 2 seconds that any of these professors care, right? They are laughing behind the backs of North American Indian tribes. Don't ever think otherwise. They literally believe they're superior. They just don't say it out loud, okay? But what if there's another reason why the North American Indians are in the technological state that they are in? That they are in the social state that they are in. What if something else was going on in North America that created this situation? What if something else happened? Now, the ironic part is that if you actually take 2 seconds and listen to any North American Indian story, suddenly you start to find answers. And of course, these answers are completely different than what Western academia currently believes. Right? These histories that the North American Indian tribes recount, it's a completely different landscape. They have all these insane problems. They overcome all kinds of things. To be honest, there's also a lot of fighting. There's also a lot of war. This is always conveniently left out too, by the way. Right? Because North American Indians have to be perfect, peaceful hippies. Not even close. They were warriors, and they fought brutal conflicts. Right, this is not debated, it's just that nobody brings this up. Right? You're not allowed to talk about this anymore. But there was a huge warrior culture within the North American Indians. That's a fact. There's no way around that. And absolutely brutal battles were fought. Right? There were conquests. But a lot of this is ignored now. What's even crazier is that as you rewind the clock and you go further back into ancient times, you find that the North American Indians, depending on the tribe, and things get a little weird because tribes will intermix, they will die out, and we'll have to talk about that too. But what we start to find is that the problems that the North American Indians were dealing with are, well, they're either extraordinarily similar to problems that European ancient ancestors were dealing with, but of course we can't make that connection. That's impossible. But we also find that a lot of the problems that the North American Indians were dealing with sound too fantastical to be real. And this is what the system exploits to ensure that nobody digs deep enough. And of course, the systems have been destroying and changing evidence over the past few centuries to make sure that we do not get an accurate picture of the past. And this is what I want to talk about. This is what I want to go over, because this is what I'm seeing, and it's becoming unbelievably annoying. I'm getting sick of running into stupid dead ends because some mainstream Western academic society decided that they were the authority on something that they have no clue about. They don't have anything. But they get to tell me what I'm allowed to do and what I'm allowed to think about. No, I don't think so, dude. No, we're not doing that, no. So let's start at the beginning of this story, of the hiding and the obfuscation of North American history. Let's start at the beginning. And for me, the beginning will be when the Europeans arrive in the North American continent. Let's start there. All right, so we have Columbus heading over in the 1400s, and then more people will start heading over after that. Now, I know that some of you right now are screaming at me saying that there were other people over here before that, and you're correct. Okay, you are correct. And we'll talk about that too, but let me just start with the basic story. Let me just start with the basic landscape so we can get an idea of what I'm complaining about right now that's pissing me off. Okay. So the Europeans show up. When the Europeans show up, they start to make a lot of very interesting discoveries. And these discoveries will continue for centuries. They will start in the 1400s, and they will go into the 1500s, 1600s, 1800s, 1900s. Europeans will continue to make all kinds of weird discoveries as they start to spread out across the landscape. Even more interesting, when the Europeans and everybody else, whoever the hell is coming over, begin to integrate more with the North American Indians and everybody starts to kind of meld together, the stories that the North American Indians will tell the Europeans will start to explain a lot of these weird discoveries. Now, back in the day, these explanations were generally taken as fact. We live in a very different time right now. I don't think a lot of people realize this. The way people thought, back in the 16 and 1700s, for example, is completely different than now. And you might say, well, no kidding, dude, I know that. Right? Everybody hundreds of years ago was primitive. They were not as smart as me. Right? That's the general way that people look at this. Nothing could be further from the truth. What's really interesting is that while, yes, today we do know a lot of stuff. We do. Fair enough. There has been fantastic work done by real scientists, real historians, and we've made some great discoveries. I'm not trying to take away anything from that. But that doesn't mean the people 400 years ago were idiots. Right? They were still moving and shaking. They were still figuring things out, and they had not received the mass amounts of propagandized psychological programming that we have received today. So the way they thought, the way they could look at the world around them was completely different than today. So when they hear stories from a North American Indian that says something to the effect of, no, we did not build those mounds. It was a completely different race of people that built those mounds. They took them seriously. Right? We have lost this in the modern age. And we have lost it because we have been told by authoritative institutions that we are not allowed to think about anything other than what they tell us to think. We are not allowed to listen to the North American Indian history and take it at face value. You are not allowed to do that in the modern age. Screw that. I'm done with that. So what happens if we ignore the modern institutions. What happens if we get rid of mainstream academia? What happens if we tell the United States government to go pump itself? Right? We're not worried about what they tell us is the truth. What we are left with is a completely different past. What we start to find is that the Europeans that are heading over here are making discoveries such as they are finding all these weird, huge mounds. And these mounds are artificial. And they are all over the place on the eastern side of the United States. Now, for most people, a mound of dirt is not that interesting. All right, it's not, and I get why. It's a mound of dirt, fine, whatever. But a lot of people don't understand the size and the scope of some of these mounds. Right? You have mounds that are upwards of 100 feet plus high. Done by humans that, supposedly did not have access to excavators or, tractors or anything like that. Yes, piling dirt up is technically, a simple concept. But if I ask you to go pile up dirt, let's just say 20 feet tall, I promise you, you are suddenly going to balk at that problem. And by the way, if I give you just a shovel, I'm like, here, go start stacking dirt up 20 feet tall. You're going to be like, man, really? I'm not doing that. That sucks. And yeah, it does suck because that's a lot of work. It's a ton of work to move and build just 20 feet worth of dirt. Now make it 100 feet tall. Now make it like 300 feet wide at the base. Right? Suddenly, the dirt mound construction becomes one hell of a task. It becomes a monumental task. What this means is that whoever was doing this might not have been as primitive as modern academia claims. To make it even more interesting, the way these mounds are built, they actually do have what we would call dirt construction. There are varied layers of dirt that support the other layers on top of it in a way that is conducive to longevity. It's not just people grabbing dirt, throwing it in a pile, and calling it a day. These people were sorting dirt layers. There was thought put into the construction of these mounds. And then, of course, the mounds seem to have stood the test of time because of this intellectual capability. Right? Most people don't know about this. Most people think dirt construction is easy. There's a whole science behind dirt construction. Right? When you go and you build a highway or a freeway or whatever, and you start piling up that dirt, you have to do it in a very specific way. You don't just grab random dirt, throw it in there, and call it a day. You don't do that. Right? There are techniques and there are ways of doing this to ensure architectural and structural integrity. They did this with those dirt mounds. Okay, so interesting, but still dirt, whatever. Here's the thing, with modern mainstream academia, they just say, oh yeah, the North American Indians, they built these mounds because it's just dirt, and they just sat there and built up a bunch of dirt because they were savages and that's all they could do, and yeah, whatever, let's move on. That is literally how they look at it, and that's how they teach it. They don't teach it as offensively, but they do look at it as if it's that simple, as if these people are just nothing but cavemen. And of course, unfortunately, most people will buy into this because the story has already been set for basically everybody. The North American Indians, they were simple. So yes, of course, piling up dirt was probably the best they could do, and nobody questions it. Nobody thinks on it further, and then that explanation is acceptable. That explanation is not acceptable because that explanation is intrinsically false. And it is false because the North American Indians themselves tell us that they did not build those mounds. They did not. They didn't do it. They don't take credit for it. They've never taken credit for it. This is a modern academic situation. For those of you who are wondering or are thinking, yes, but didn't they find some Indian chiefs buried in the mounds? You're talking about what is known as an intrusive burial. Any body that has been found in any mound, and they're rare by the way, is always found on the upper layers. It is never found at the bottom center. Something else is found at the bottom center. But on the top surface layers, you find what would be considered a general North American Indian body. The reason why you find it at the top layers is because, like I said, it's an intrusive burial. These people dug into the mound a little bit, the pre-existing mound, and they buried the person in there and they moved on. What academia does is they take this intrusive burial as proof that the North American Indians, in the modern conception, built the mounds. It's insane. It's ridiculous. It's the dumbest thing you can imagine, but nobody's questioning this. And once you start to question it, what starts to happen? Right? We start to run into those barriers that I was talking about. We start to walk into the political barriers. We start to run into the academic barriers. Hell, we even start to run into corporate barriers depending on what we're doing. I mean, that's how crazy this is. You're not even allowed to listen to the true history of the North American Indian. You're not allowed to do that. It's impossible. It's illegal, essentially, at this point. Modern academia is the authority, not the North American Indian tribes themselves. Right? This is what we are now forced to believe. Nobody really sees it like that because people believe that scholars are being honest, but scholars are just regurgitating what they've been told to regurgitate, right? They don't know any better. They bought into all the garbage propaganda just like anybody else. All right, so anyway, so the Europeans start to run into the mounds. They see that North America is fresh. They also start to run into other things buried in the ground. They start to find weird artifacts here and there scattered around the continent. Not only are these artifacts man-made, but they also start to find weird carvings and weird fossils or bones. North America starts to look like a very weird, perhaps, post-apocalyptic area that has recently recovered. And people are noticing this. What's interesting about this perspective is not just that people are looking around and noticing this, it's that people during this time period actually expect this to exist. So you have to remember, the mindset of somebody like 500 years ago is a completely different animal than that of today. The people back in the day were, I guess for lack of a better word, were more religiously inclined. Now that does not mean that everybody was a brainless religious zealot and just blindly believed all the insanity. They weren't like that, and I can't stress that enough because, the atheist argument nowadays loves to try to twist it like that. But the reality is, the people back in the day, 500 years ago, let's just say 400 to 500 years ago for our discussion right now, the reality is they are much closer to the last major catastrophe that would hit Earth than we are today. So they are still dealing with those effects, and they're dealing with the aftermath and the memories of that last catastrophe, which in this case would be the Zero event, is still relatively fresh. And I say relatively because they're still about 500 years, away from it. So it's not that fresh, let's be honest. But there are a lot of stories that are still being passed down. And one of those stories will eventually, or I should say, one of the compilations of those stories will eventually be compiled into the Bible, or at least a part of the Bible. And that would be the whole Armageddon thing. So for those of you who are not aware, technically speaking, Armageddon has already happened, and this was recorded as the apocalypse in the New Testament. Now, it gets complicated with the Bible, and I don't want to get out of scope for this talk, but, the reality is, Fomenko has done amazing work. Fomenko and his team, they did amazing work to sort of prove that the Bible was not created until around the 13th to 14th century AD. And I mean created in the purest sense of creation. The story of the apocalypse is simply a retelling of the zero event. However, the writers of the Bible twisted it around to make it seem like it's something that's going to happen in the future. And there's reasons why they did that, and that is way outside of the scope of this talk. But anyway, the reality is, though, is that the reason why the populations were more likely to believe in things like this, crazy, apocalypses, catastrophes, etc., it's not because they were stupid peasants. It's because they were closer to events like that, and to be fair, there would have still been, aftermath events probably still taking place up in the sky here and there during those periods of time. Just because a major cataclysm, sweeps by Earth and messes everything up, that doesn't mean it's gone the next day permanently, right? These events take time to fade away. Right, there's still, garbage in space flying around. There's still going to be other things going on. And I guarantee you, 500-600 years ago, every once in a while, people were still seeing some of this stuff in the sky. And in fact, we know that they absolutely were, which is one of the reasons why people were so willing to believe in religious texts, because there was still crazy stuff happening in the sky back in that period of time. Now, if you're wondering why we don't see stuff like that today, the reality is we do, but now it's rare. And the reason why it is rare is because so much time has passed. We just live in the time period to where, the solar system is cleaner. Just to be blunt, that's the time we live in. That is why we've been able to advance the way we have been able to in the past few centuries. That is because we have not had to worry about any kind of crazy cataclysms. Our ancestors did. All right, so that's why. Okay, anyway, I'm off scope. Back to North America. So, the populations of Europeans who are coming over and seeing North America, they're not terribly surprised, because they expect some kind of a catastrophic event to have already taken place to some degree or another, and we would expect to find areas that just aren't populated with humans all that much. Right? This is what they expect, and so that's why it's not crazy to them. Which, of course, in turn, explains why they are so willing to give, God all this credit and all of this stuff. It's because this is what they expect to find. This is what really should be happening around them, given the reality of what the planet has gone through in the past few centuries. Right, so the psychology would be different. However, to be fair, they are still far enough away from the zero event to, have a pretty decent disconnect from what really happened. So that's why you do end up finding maybe a lot more, metaphysical religious stuff injected into their perspective. But anyway, so back to the stuff they're finding in North America. The next thing they start to find in North America that is not a surprise to them at all is when they start discovering the bones of giants. Now, the bones of giants are found all over the world. All right, this is not debatable. And for anybody who thinks that the giant situation is going too far, I don't, it's still something that I'm working on myself, but I have to be honest, there is so much evidence that supports all of this, you can't ignore it. One of the things that happens in North America is that people start to run into graves of giants. And of course, they'll run into these graves not only just in, random areas in the ground, that happens, but the mounds themselves will more often than not possess the bones of giants. Now, for the skeptics out there, I get it. I understand. I was right there with you, like 6-7 years ago, really. But we have so many people reporting this. We have all this evidence of this stuff existing. And I mean physical evidence. We have the tools. We have their structures. We have all this stuff. Nowadays, we even have the genetics and the science. We have pictures and physical body parts as well, right? We have all of these things. Now, the average skeptic will look at all of those things and they will say they are all hoaxes. No matter what the evidence is, it will always be a hoax. Now, you can't do that. That's not fair. You can't look at every piece of evidence that is supplied to you that is proving something you don't like and just brush it off as a hoax, just because you don't like it. You can't do that, and that is what's being done with the whole giant situation. Now, I'm not going to get into that further, but this is one of the major points that happens in North America, or I should say one of the major discoveries. People start running into giant bones everywhere. And they're not dinosaurs. Remember, these are full-size humanoids, artifacts and all. Now, when people are digging these up, when they are finding these bones, they are not shocked and surprised. They might be a little bit taken aback because this is not something they generally find in their day-to-day life. But when they are finding these bones of giants, they are not going, wow, what the hell? This is impossible. How could this ever have existed? There's no way there could be humans this big. They're not thinking that at all, right? They are expecting to find bones of giants in the world. There's nothing weird about this. They might be surprised that they personally get to see them, but they're not surprised of the existence. And this happens all over North America. Because they're not technically all that, shocked or surprised by this in the sense that they think it's weird, it becomes just another day in life for most people. Because all of these Europeans coming over already believe in giants. They already believe in the concept of giant humans walking the earth, before all of these catastrophes. There's nothing weird about this to them. It's already part of real history for them. So when they're finding these bones, this is just confirming the history for them. Now, because this is not, some huge shocker, it's not played up as much as it really should have been. When these settlers are finding these bones, they're not going out of their way to preserve them. They're not, there's no science going on. There's no such thing as archaeology. It's just expected. They're there. They don't have the tools to, do anything with the stuff anyway. So what happens is that all of this stuff will become lost to time very quickly. To make matters even worse, the bones of these giants, for some weird reason, and I know that skeptics are going to love this one, but for whatever reason, the bones seem to crumble to dust very quickly once they are exposed to air. Now, there are scientific reasons for this happening, but, all of that is outside of the scope of this. But I get it, right? You can say, well, then where's your evidence? Well, there's tons of other evidence. Like, we actually do have pictures of the bodies. We have... Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. The whole topic is very frustrating to me nowadays. Anyway... So, when the Europeans are showing up, they're finding all of this crazy stuff. I mean, crazy relative to how we would look at it today. Now, to make things even crazier, if you will, the North American Indians, they have their histories corroborating all of these discoveries. The North American Indians are not surprised that people of large stature are being discovered, buried in the ground. This is not interesting to any of them, right? They know this. They've already got the stories. In fact, their stories are rather detailed because they, in some cases, literally had to deal with these giant people not too long ago. All right? The history is there for them. So nobody's surprised. Nobody is documenting this stuff in the 1700s and going, oh my God, what an amazing discovery. Nobody's doing that because to everybody back in the day, this stuff was normal. There was no big deal. Now this works against us today because that means that nobody was cataloging this appropriately. Nobody was applying any kind of a scientific methodology to, categorizing all of this and saving the evidence. Not to say it did not happen, but it certainly did not happen on the scale it should have. right? Think about it like this. If you go out today and you find a cell phone on the sidewalk, you're not surprised. You're not shocked. You don't find that technically amazing piece of technology interesting because you have one. Everybody has one. They're everywhere. They exist. It just doesn't matter. Right, so you throw that in the garbage, or you move on, or you grab it and you sell it for crack, whatever, whatever. It doesn't matter. You are not going to scientifically catalog that find because that find is not a find for you. Right? Same thing for the people back in the day who were making all of these discoveries in North America. Right? It's not that it's not interesting, but it's not a big deal. Like, these people expect to find this stuff, so it's just another day for them. Just as it's another day for you if you find a cell phone on the ground. If I were to take that cell phone and transport it back 500 years and somebody back then were to find it, yeah, I promise you there would be a different approach taken to that discovery, right? Completely different. But because it's the norm, it just doesn't matter. Now, what's interesting is that all of this stuff is the norm. Like today, in the modern times, finding giant bones or something like that would be insane. And they are still discovered today, however, like the show was supposed to be talking about, these discoveries are being taken. These discoveries are being handed over to authorities that are supposed to keep science in mind and are supposed to be looking for the truth, but the reality is they are just taking, stealing, and destroying any evidence that goes against the modern Western interpretation of how history goes. All right, that's where we're at right now, and there's no way around this. It's funny, historical discoveries that rewrite history are found all the time, all over the world. Right, you can right now go to Google or some garbage, and you can just Google up some modern day articles, and you can see, finding has the potential to rewrite history, or this finding over here will rewrite history, or blah, 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 right? That stuff is everywhere. And it's been there for decades. But how often does any of these discoveries rewrite history? Never. Never. It never rewrites history. History in the Western world is never rewritten relative to scientific discoveries. It never happens. All right, and it's not happening now. Any evidence that is discovered over here in North America that contradicts anything right now that the Western academic institutions are preaching, it goes in the garbage. It is hidden. It is taken away. And I am seeing this constantly everywhere I look nowadays when I try to study real history. And it's starting to really piss me off. Like, it's just, Anyway, so North American history is completely different from what we have been taught. Now, another thing that is fascinating with North American history that is very much obfuscated and nobody really thinks about because this is well beyond, most everybody's thought process. And I don't mean in an intellectual way. I just mean nobody really cares about it. And that is geologically. So the geology of North America is absolutely insane. And the picture that North American geology paints is one of probably the worst effect of an absolute catastrophe that the entire planet saw. All right, so the problem with North America is that it's fresh. Okay, why is it fresh? I mean, how do you get a fresh continent? Well, if you scrub a continent free of humans and other life that can do damage or whatever, you can start fresh, right? You can recover. It doesn't take too terribly long for land to recover. Give land a few centuries and you'll have forests. It's not a big deal. So how did North America get this freshness? And why is it devoid of things like megalithic structures? Where the hell is the history at? Well, when we factor in the catastrophes, all of this makes sense. Now, the problem with the modern era is that the catastrophes that are now being proposed, simply out of scientific reasoning, by the way, not out of some kind of a ScHiZo theory, but the science really does show that North America went through an incredible change only a few thousand years ago. Now, the ironic part is that North American Indians still retain the history of these events. Right? So it's funny. You have the science and you have the history. You have the eyewitness testimony. And all of this is ignored. Now, the geology of North America is fascinating for several reasons. And the main reason is that it still has all of the evidence of the two major catastrophes that affected planet Earth in the past few thousand years. And those two events are the Venus event, which is by far the most destructive catastrophe that Earth went through, minus the deluge, but the deluge happened way before this, so I'm not going to get into that. But the Venus event really does set the stage for what North America looks like today. So when we look at the geological evidence in North America, we start to find out why we do not see any megalithic structures in existence anywhere on the continent. We start to understand why there are not, all of these old ancient cities preserved in some form or another on the surface. The reality of the North American geological situation is this. All of the geology of North America supports nothing but massive cataclysm in only the last few thousand years. And this includes everything from explaining why the eastern side to the mid center of the United States is relatively flat, minus the Appalachians, and we'll talk about that. But then when you hit the west side of the United States and Canada, suddenly you have just this, insane mountain range, right? The Sierra Nevadas. Now, the history of the Sierra Nevadas are fascinating as well, but one of the things that it is definitely missing is the same thing that the east side is missing. There's no megaliths, there's no ancient structures anywhere. There's nothing, and in fact, the Sierra Nevadas are actually pretty desolate, relatively speaking. Right? There's nothing up here. It's just mountains and desert and forest. That's it. I mean, there's no ancient settlements. There's no ancient ruins. There's no sign of any kind of ancient life. There's nothing. So why is that the case? At least on the east side, you have the mound builders, right? You have that. It's something. You have some impressive I guess you could kind of call them megalithic structures. But on the west side of the United States, we have nothing. There's nothing here. It's a total desolate, land that has been destroyed. This begs the question, why? Did nobody live in the Sierra Nevadas? I mean, you can live up here. People live up here. I live up here. But no ancient civilizations seemed to have wanted anything to do with the area. Now, if we listen to the North American Indian histories and we look at the geology, we understand why immediately. Because the North American Indian history claims that the Sierra Nevadas, as well as the Appalachians, rose up overnight only a few thousand years ago. Now, if you are going to have a situation to where you are ripping mountains up overnight, that is probably going to be one hell of a catastrophic event. Anything that lived in the area is probably going to be wiped out. And if you follow the science and you see what actually took place in North America, yes, everything was completely obliterated. Right, the Sierra Nevada mountains were created in probably one of the most destructive times that the planet has ever seen. Now, if that's the case, this would explain why we don't have evidence of ancient civilizations. The event that took place on the western half of the North American continent was so brutal, so violent, so insane that it quite literally vaporized anything that existed in the area. And we'll do a show on that later because that's a whole show and it's absolutely amazing. And it explains everything. But I'll just leave it at a crazy catastrophe. All right, so if we have a crazy catastrophe, suddenly we start to understand why we don't have all this evidence. for any ancient civilization that lived in the area. And of course, this goes along with what the North American Indians claim. And of course, we are not allowed to have any other kind of story that is not sanctioned by Western academics, that is not sanctioned by the government. Right? You're not allowed to bring up any other evidence that goes against the established timeline in North America. So the problem is that the established timeline in North America makes no sense. It doesn't make scientific sense from a humanist perspective, right? Human history does not corroborate what the mainstream says, and geological evidence does not corroborate that story either. It's ironic, it's funny actually, because a lot of mainstream geologists have a problem with the geology of North America because the story that it tells geologists is not one of millions and billions of years. It's a story of only thousands of years. And it's across the whole damn continent. It's insane. Now, if you haven't heard of this, it's because uniformitarianism has to be pushed forth no matter what. You're not allowed to go around that. So anybody who makes these discoveries, they're not allowed to go and change the geological story. They can't do that. You can go find the papers, and we'll talk about that in a different show because it's important. And there's plenty of geologists out there who are talking about it, but okay, let's talk about this really quick before I let you guys go. So the geological science really does prove that North America went through a reshaping process that was extraordinarily violent and quite literally insane, and it happened only a few thousand years ago. However, the people who are pushing this, the science is legit, but the people who grab onto this information are unfortunately creationists trying to prove the deluge. And this is frustrating because the geology of North America proves that there was some kind of large water action that did indeed sweep across much of the surface of the eastern half of the continent. That exists. There's no way around that. Problem is that creationists only know of one flood, the deluge, and so they're trying to make it sound like that is the deluge. They're trying to make it sound like that's the evidence for the deluge, and that's 100% wrong. Right? That evidence is not the deluge. Evidence for the deluge is probably almost impossible to find because the Venus event, which created that flood evidence that we're talking about in North America, wiped out everything that came before. The flood evidence that we find in North America was not the deluge. It was that giant mountain of water that Venus drug across the planet only a few thousand years ago. And that is corroborated by cultures all over the planet. It's not the deluge. They were not suffering, 40 days of rain or whatever the hell. Completely different situation, right? The deluge doesn't work with the evidence in North America. I say this because I want to make sure everybody understands that that's the wrong way scientifically. And then, of course, they believe God did it because creationists have no idea about plasma physics and the reality of astronomy. So then, it's just ridiculous, man. You have to fight like two sides that are both wrong, and they both get, center stage, and then nobody wants to listen to real science. It's just obnoxious, okay? And by the way, the people at the top, they know all this, and they're laughing their asses off at it because they know exactly what's happening. Right? They have no problem pushing creationism and like the mainstream garbage because they know both are wrong. They already know it. They know it. They know everything I'm saying here. They know more than this. All right. So here's the problem with North American history. It's being destroyed right in front of us, right? The government is going out of its way to steal artifacts and give artifacts that do not belong to certain people so that those certain people can make them disappear. That's happening every day. Right? There's literally laws nowadays that don't allow you to go and see artifacts anymore. We're not allowed to do history. Right? It's bad for everybody, and this is happening everywhere, and it's unbelievably annoying. Oh, I'm just gonna, okay. All right. Okay, so for those of you who believe that there is nothing interesting to study in North America, I would just say to you that there is. And in my opinion, North America is actually becoming more important to me than any other continent, not just because I live here, but because of the story that it actually tells. North America, and by extension South America as well, by the way, but South America still has temples and stuff, so they're not quite the same. They're connected, anyway. But North America, in my opinion, is one of the keys that most people are missing when they go to study history. Because most people, as I said earlier, have no problem really just overlooking anything that happened in North America. Right? North America seems to have some of the insane history that out of any continent on the planet. Okay, here, before I let you go, I know we're gonna go over an hour, but check this out. Just to give you a little taste about what we'll discuss in the future. Okay, so in the Sierra Nevadas, there is no sign of ancient societies or civilizations or whatever. Doesn't exist. There's nothing up here. I mean, I'm happy to be wrong, by the way, but what I'm saying is, show me something like Göbekli Tepe. Show me something like ancient Egypt. That's what I'm talking about, right? Show me, that's the kind of stuff I want to see. We don't have that around here. It just doesn't exist. The history around here, especially on the west side of the United States, very fresh. It's very fresh. There's not a whole lot here. There's no artifacts. There's nothing. Right? Any artifacts you find is basically from, the European times, or maybe you can still discover, Native American stuff from, maybe only, 3 or 4 centuries ago. It's not that old, right? There's nothing here that's crazy. All right, but check this out. Now, the reason why, like I said, is because North America went through a complete reshaping of its surface. So whatever North America looked like before the Venus event, I have no idea. I have no idea what the outline of the continent was, and nobody does. It's gone. That whole thing is erased. Right? That's also something that's very important to remember, that the continents did not look, all of them, did not look like they look today only 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. They were in a completely different shoreline situation. Right? Anyway, so check this out though. It certainly seems like there was land, livable land, prior to the Venus event. So my guess would be that, yeah, there were cultures living here. They were here. They were running around. They were probably, building stuff, right? Maybe even megalithic. Where is all of this stuff? Well, interestingly enough, some of it has been found thousands of feet buried in the mountains, buried in granite. If you go look around, you can find amazing stories of miners in the Sierra Nevadas digging, hundreds if not thousands of feet into the rock, and they will find encased in granite things like wheels, artifacts, etc. Why are those things hundreds to thousands of feet under the ground? And how the hell did they get encased in granite? In my opinion, it is the Venus event that will create that situation. There were indeed ancient civilizations here in North America, but they were wiped out during that event. And I mean vaporized, literally had rock built on top of them. This would explain why we find those weird oddities buried in the mountains. And by the way, this will explain why you find this all over the planet when it is found. Depending on the situation, they might vary a little bit. The North American situation is very unique, and we will cover that in a different show because I don't want to spoil it, but it takes forever to go over. But that's the catastrophism side explains why we find those artifacts. It explains why the North American Indians have stories about the mountains being built overnight. It explains the catastrophic events. It explains why we would have possibly had giant or larger humans running around back in the day. Everything was different. The Venus event will change all of it. So North America is not worth ignoring. It's like, start diving into this, because the reality is the Smithsonian is doing a fantastic job of obfuscating everything and destroying evidence. The United States government is destroying evidence and doing everything they can to make sure that nobody is figuring stuff out. And of course, academia is not on our side either. I mean, this is what we're fighting against. And by the way, the clock is ticking. Like, we are losing artifacts daily. We are losing time. There will literally be a time in the near future to where it will be impossible for people like you and me to recover real history. It's getting to that point. That's just where we're at. I mean, we're almost there as it is now, right? So start looking at this stuff. Link me things that you find in North America that are crazy. I'm looking for that stuff. That's what I need to find. I need to see like those legitimate oddities, right? I want to see those things, because the catastrophism has the possibility of explaining those oddities. The real history could explain those things. Things that initially just seem out of place. Oh, it's an out of place artifact. It's not out of place at all, right? It's exactly where we would expect to find it if the history was real. Oh my, okay, we're done. I'm finished. I'm going to shut this off.